You know all those scenes in Game of Thrones inside the Red Keep where you have the court arrayed in all their finery and the courtiers are all chatting or playing their games or entertaining each other and hosting little feasts? The thing about those scenes is that to truly understand them requires knowing how a noble court is actually constructed. It requires understanding the architecture of power, the people who make up the court, the legitimacy applied to those people, and the language they use to communicate with each other, and the low-level internal Cold War that dominates every single palace. That is going to be the topic of today's discussion in this third episode on our series of how to create fantasy courts. If you're watching this on your phone and you're excited, go ahead and hit that hype button or whatever new feature YouTube is testing out this week to appease the algorithm lords. Like, comment, subscribe, and welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. First, we're going to talk about the foundations of legitimacy. Why and how does a noble get to be in court in the first place? And how does status apply to them? This also applies to our court overall on the macro level. What is the court's dominant source of legitimacy? Different societies have completely different definitions of authorities. So let's go through the various foundations of legitimacy that you can apply to your royal court. The first and most obvious foundation is raw military power. The feudal systems in both medieval Europe and the Far East originally arose by elite warriors bringing order to chaotic, fractured landscapes. We see this in Japan's feudal history, which, while it wasn't exactly the same as European feudalism, features a highly recognizable martial class system. When military might is the foundation of power, a noble's court is built entirely around defense and subjugation. A great example of this is John Gwain's Bloodsworn universe. It's a chaotic environment created by a cataclysmic Ragnarok event, and the Jarls who have risen to take control are all military leaders. They are warriors surrounded by their Drengar, the sworn fighters who serve them. Their systemic legitimacy is derived from the fact that they will actively defend their people from rival warlords and also from the terrifying monsters that are roaming the ruins of the world. Military might gives both individual nobles and the court itself the right to rule. Our second form of legitimacy is bloodline, lineage, and, frequently tied into it, the divine blessings of the gods. In Lord of the Rings, we see Gondor ruled by the ruling stewards for generations. They hold the administrative reins of power because they were originally appointed by the crown. But because they lack the true royal bloodline of Elendil, they are never held in the same mystical regard as the true king. When Aragorn finally shows up, his pure hereditary lineage immediately displaces them. This kind of bloodline legitimacy was incredibly common in our own late medieval history. Rulers and noble houses went to absurd lengths to trace their lineage back to Charlemagne or other legendary conquerors to justify their current status. There is a fascinating exploration of this in Catherine Kerr's Devery books. During a rebellion, the province of Eldred tries to rebel against the heir of the Devery king. To validate their claim, they track down two separate hereditary lines descending from the original Eldred kings, both inherited through the female line. To form the ultimate political claim, they marry these two distant cousins to each other so that their heirs will possess a double bloodline inheritance. Lineage politics is incredibly potent for writers because it is entirely about tying your current authority to the specific deeds and glory of your ancestors. It is a backward-looking form of legitimacy, and it forms one of the primary fronts of that Cold War we'll be discussing. Our third form of legitimacy is magic and divinity, where wielding arcane powers grants you institutional authority. On a basic level, this can function exactly like military might. If a mundane warrior can beat you up, a mage can hit you with a fireball, which naturally commands obedience. But it becomes far more interesting when magic is deeply backed into the legal structure of the court itself. For example, in my own epic fantasy series, the Sangwheel Chronicles, the nobility of the Empire of Lumiaron is structurally dependent on magic. To be a lower noble, you must be a habilleur, a type of mage whose magic affects and enhances their own physical body. To be a high noble, like a duke or the emperor, you must be a Dusang mage, capable of projecting destructive magical forces to alter the external world. In my world, knowing Dusang, surviving its brutal trials, and wearing the guileless tassel of a Dusang mage is the baseline of political legitimacy. Next, you have economic wealth as a pillar of legitimacy, which gives rise to oligarchic courts where you can effectively buy a seat at the table. Historically, the great merchant empires of Tyre, the Phoenicians, and Carthage operated with a heavy amount of oligarchy built into their ruling structures. The later Venetian Republic is another great example of this. While Venice eventually implemented strict aristocratic registries of the Book of Gold and the Book of Silver to lock down status, in its early days, sufficient merchant wealth allowed families to buy their way onto the Great Council, the very council responsible for electing the Doge. If you have enough coin, you get a seat at the table, and the court becomes an extension of the marketplace. This leads us into our final high-level foundation, elective legitimacy. Now, bear in mind, as world builders, we are not talking about modern democratic elections based on one person, one vote. No. This is a restrictive, aristocratic election. Think of the Holy Roman Empire, where a select council of prince electors voted to choose who would ascend the throne. The historical papal court operates in the exact same mechanic. The Pope is elected by the College of Cardinals, and once invested with that supreme divine authority, the Pope turns around and grants institutional legitimacy to everyone else in the hierarchy by appointing them to office. Elective systems allow the nobility to maintain absolute control over the voting pool, choosing a leader from their own ranks whom they believe is best suited to protect their collective interests. So those are our macro level foundations of power. But one of the most critical elements that world builders often overlook is that legitimacy is rarely uniform. A real court isn't a monolith. It is an active melting pot where individuals representing these different kinds of legitimacy are forced to survive alongside one another. And that brings us to the incredibly dynamic world-building mechanic that exists in almost every historical and fictional palace, the quiet, backstabbing Cold War between bloodline and merit. So here's the thing, monarchs, East or West, and probably in the Americas as well, though I haven't deeply studied those specific courts, absolutely loved appointing people based on merit. They could not get enough of it. Editing Marie here. Do I look like I've been editing too long? I've been editing too long. Anyway, I realized as I was doing this section that despite the fact that this is my second take of the video, I forgot to put in that merit isn't actually a legitimacy that goes into a court. Merit is a devolved legitimacy in my kind of model of the court. So what happens is somebody has a legitimacy like military might or magic or blowing things up or bloodline or they're a god or whatever. And then they appoint other people and their legitimacy devolves onto those other people. And those other people might have merit in the view of the kind of master of the legitimacy, the patriarch of the legitimacy, if you will, the guy who actually holds the legitimacy that the rest of the court accepts. And they then share that legitimacy with those they appoint below them. So these guys could all have merit in the eyes of the appointer, although their merit doesn't need to apply to anyone else. Good Lord, my hair looks terrible. I think I'm going to go take a shower when I put on this video to render. Okay, bye. Take Imperial China, for example. The emperors appointed eunuchs to serve as high-level overseers of the palace. They served as direct counterweight both to the hereditary aristocracy and the official imperial bureaucracy, the scholar gentry who passed the rigorous state exams. Because eunuchs couldn't have children or carry on family lineage, the emperors reasoned that they would dedicate 100% of their loyalty and time to the crown. It's the exact same logic the Byzantine Empire used, where eunuchs also held massive institutional power. In China, this structural division sparked a bloody, albeit hidden and drawn-out war between the outer court, the moralistic scholar bureaucrats, and the inner court, composed of the hyper-loyal and sometimes deeply corrupt eunuchs who controlled physical access to the emperor's person and ear. In the West, you saw a similar dynamic play out when kings bypassed the high nobility to appoint low-ranking knights, merchants, or even foreigners to high-status administrative roles based on merit. We see this historical conflict personified in Game of Thrones with Varys. Varys began life as an enslaved eunuch, crossed the narrow sea, and somehow climbed his way into the Targaryen court to become the master of whispers. His ultimate survival mechanism and his functional loyalty was entirely separate from the traditional entitlement of the Westerosi aristocrats. And there is a very practical reason monarchs did this. In the feudal system, if a king pisses off a high-ranking duke, that duke can simply pack up, go home to his ancestral lands, call upon his banners, forge alliances with other disgruntled lords, and launch a massive civil war or coup. There is a reason history is riddled with internal wars, rebellions, and sudden executions, after all. Feudalism is incredibly rigid between classes, but within the ruling class, it's actually quite flat, and there can be a lot of conflict. So a medieval king was less about an absolute dictator and more a primus inter pares, first among equals. He was just the top noble of his specific social class, not an untouchable god king looking down on a unified state. And this is one of the single biggest mistakes people make when world building feudalism. They think that feudal states are strong, highly centralized governments. In reality, the traditional feudal state is a weak central state. The true institutional strength lay entirely within the independent power of the noble houses. The aristocracy possessed their own independent legitimacy, their own private wealth, and their own standing armies. That makes it incredibly dangerous for a monarch to rely solely on aristocrats to run the government. To counter this vulnerability, clever kings hired low-born lawyers, wealthy merchants, and literate foreign clerks to operate their spy networks, manage their treasury, and enforce their legal systems. Because these merit-based officials had zero bloodline legitimacy, their entire status, safety, and wealth depended on the survival of the king. By elevating the lowborn, the monarch effectively centralized their own power, leaving the traditional nobility fuming in the wings. Okay, now that we understand legitimacy and the potential conflict it brings, let's talk about the people who form the court. But before we do that, I have some exciting news. I have just launched the Kickstarter pre-launch page for my upcoming fantasy novel, Blood and Bloom in Las Vegas. Blood and Bloom is an urban fantasy mystery written in a gritty noir style featuring a druid protagonist. It actually won the Flash 500 novel opening competition, and it has all of the deep, intricate world-building elements you'd expect from this channel. That includes a fairy court system that harkens after feudalism, with 4 elemental fairy courts and various nobles attached to each of those. The story also has deep mythological roots, stretching all the way back to ancient Babylonian myths, and it actively draws those myths into the modern world. If that sounds like your kind of read, follow the link in the description below and click on Notify Me so that you get an email the second the Kickstarter goes live this July. Okay, now back to the show. One of the first things you need to understand when constructing a fantasy court is that it isn't a monolith. It is split into three distinct, often competing operational groups: the leadership, the working court, and the non-working court. They don't share the same lives, and they certainly don't share the same goals. The leadership consists of the sovereign, the inner council, and the high-level officials. These people are physically present at court because they hold independent power, regional resources, and systemic legitimacy. Think of your small council in Westeros or the council of the monarch in Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar. All of these people hold an intrinsic institutional role that demands their presence at court. And attached to these leaders are their personal staffs, the secretaries and administrators who derive their practical authority from their employers. This is your cabinet and your government. You need a treasurer managing coin, the religious representative integrating the state faith, the chief advisor, like the Hand of the King in Game of Thrones. You need a spy master, and you need all of the people who speak for their various clans and regions, as well as clerks and your low-level priests and your secretaries and all of those kind of people you need to run a kingdom before automation. Here you would use your noble houses to be the secretary of the Privy Seal, or you would use a knight to be a clerk, or etc., etc., etc. The working court is the engine that keeps the palace functional. They are the facilitators who ensure that leadership can actually do their jobs without being buried in the logistics of daily life. Two of the most politically underrated roles here are the heralds and the master of revels. Heralds are your gatekeepers of political branding. As we see in Catherine Kerr's Devery books, a herald is a master genealogist who regulates political symbology. They tell you exactly what you can and cannot put in a sigil because they know whose lineages claim which icons. The master of revels, meanwhile, is effectively the gatekeeper of social geography. They control the schedule and the budget and the seating chart. If hangers-on need to pitch a contract to the High Treasurer, they aren't knocking on the Treasurer's office door. They are bribing the Master of Revels to ensure they are strategically seated next to the Treasurer at the state ball. And speaking of hangers-on, the non-working court is where the tension truly lies. This group is a mix of socialites, schemers, plotters, political hostages, younger sons with no inheritance, and anyone else desperate to turn social capital into actual wealth. For them, court life is an exhausting non-stop performance of elegance just to maintain their standing. They have the most diverse goals, everything from plotting coups to securing a rich marriage or gaining an influential patron. But because the leadership is busy running an entire country, they implement strict institutional barriers to keep these non-working nobles out. This is where your access rules come into play. And in order to breach those access rules, your non-working court members need to use outsiders to carry messages, or perhaps complete jobs like holding the king's candle while he changes for bed, as Louis XIV made his nobles do. Don't underestimate the political utility of people who exist on the margins of the courts and aren't really part of it, but can move freely inside it. Because they are often viewed as non-political actors, they have unprecedented mobility within the court. Courtesans, like the night-blooming flowers in Cashil's dart, move through the highest circle to deliver sensitive messages. Fools use the protective layer of comedy to mock the powerful and deliver truths that would get a normal courtier executed. And of course, the intimate attendants, like the two-door groom of the stool, gained raw private access to the monarch simply by holding a job that no one else wants. And these people can create access opportunities for your non-working court members. So, whether you are looking at characters like Melisande Scheherazade, who leveraged her own wealth to maintain a presence and at court and plot from the sidelines, or younger nobles simply trying to survive, remember this. The non-working court is constantly hunting for a way to turn proximity to power. Your job as a writer is to figure out what barriers the leadership has built to stop them, and exactly how your characters plan to break those barriers down. So when populating the court, consider these 4 categories. Country leadership, including all the positions, the clerks, the nobles, and officers that actually run the country, including your cabinet, the people with constant access to the monarch and real authority, like the treasurer, spymaster, and so on. 2. The court facilitators, who run the court like heralds, the master of revels, the groom of the stool, and all of their non-noble, normally, staff that see to lighting fires, cleaning rooms, and so on. Then the non-working court, where the schemers, the desperates, and the socialites live, and then the outsiders who can move freely through the court but aren't generally seen as political, like the fool or the night-blooming flowers of Tour d'Ange. Populate your court with all of the above, and you will have an amazing source of drama. And now, while the names of the members of this channel scroll past, the incredible patrons who provide the funds to ensure I can bring these videos out for your regular entertainment, let me tell you about the absolute importance of designing a shared language for your court. I've actually done an entire video dedicated to the language of the court, and I'll leave a link in the description. But a LARP that I was involved in perfectly illustrates how important this is, in my opinion. So, I was in a live-action roleplay, a LARP, set in Legend of the Five Rings. At the end of a formal dinner, one of the players stuck her chopsticks upright into a bowl of rice. Now, the courtly etiquette we had constructed for this Japanese-inspired world is that if you stick your chopsticks vertically into the rice, you are accusing your host of trying to poison the meal. So the moment this player did that, it created an uproar. There was challenges to duels, there were accusations flying across the hall, and the political shenanigans were a mess. It completely derailed the Lord's agenda for the evening and threw the court into chaos. But that moment was only so impactful because of the strength of our shared language as players. It only worked because everyone at the table instantly knew what that non-verbal gesture meant. So, when you are constructing your own fantasy court, you must think about how your courtiers communicate non-verbally. I know I rabbit on about non-verbal communication constantly, but it is a critical piece of the puzzle that I cover extensively in Worldbuilding Blueprints, my comprehensive book on the craft of worldbuilding. Links to my website down below. But ultimately, a court is an intense, concentrated microculture, and non-verbal communication is how that culture functions. You can go the whole hog and construct an entire systemic language out of physical props. I actually did that recently for one of the courts in Sangwil Chronicles, and I designed a complex language of hand fans, where holding a fan at a specific angle meant one thing, tapping it closed meant another, and fluttering it meant something else entirely. But your shared language doesn't have to be that intricate. It can just be small, sharp, non-verbal symbols that characters use to signal how open or how closed they are to an idea, what they truly think of a rival, or how they perceive somebody else's social standing. And in this category, don't underestimate the power of bowing and physical positioning when constructing your courtly language. How deeply does a character bow to an equal versus a superior? Is there anyone in the realm required to perform a full kowtow, kneeling completely and lowering their face to the floor? On the flip side, is who is legally permitted to remain standing when the sovereign enters the chamber? Is there a single highly privileged individual allowed to remain seated in the presence of the monarch? All of these rules are non-verbal status communicators, and they are vital for maintaining power dynamics of the ruling class. They are the gears that keep the court cohesive. In our next episode, we're going to dive straight into the mechanics of control, both control over the court itself and control of the populace outside the palace walls. We will be exploring how nobles weaponize rituals, access rights, and political hostages to maintain their grip on power. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that drop. If you've made it this far into the architecture of power, leave a chopsticks emoji in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, check out my video on models of inheritance you can use in a fantasy world. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon for another episode.